So hello, everyone. Again, my name is Angie Grove. I'm the director at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum, and welcome to our free monthly lecture series. The Ethan Allen Homestead Museum is a nonprofit museum in Burlington, Vermont, whose mission is to educate people and preserve the history of the site on which we are, which is on the intervale of the Winooski River here in Burlington. The focus on early Vermont history, but we do cover all eras of history at that time period. So today we have the privilege of having Dr. Margaret M. Bruchac with us to give this presentation, Encountering Ndakinna, Abenaki History in Vermont and New Hampshire. You are not going to be hearing a lot from me. I'm going to soon turn this over to another person to introduce Dr. Bruchac, but I do have a couple of announcements first. First up, I do want to say a thank you to our program sponsors. We do have some amazing community sponsors for all of our educational programming. So please thank with me North Country Federal Credit Union, M&T Bank, AARP Vermont, and Burlington Heritage Ford and Toyota. So thank you to those sponsors who make programs like this happen for us financially. We really appreciate their support. Okay, I also want to give a quick announcement for our next lecture, so you can put that in your calendar so you know when our next program is. And that is going to be on Sunday, February 16th from 2 to 3 p.m. And that is going to be a presenter, Dr. Richard Bell. And the title of that presentation is The Tragedy of Thomas Paine. That is another fully Zoom presentation. And so the link to register will be on our website, as well as on our Facebook page. And if you are already on our email list, you will get an email invitation to register for that program as well. Again, that's Sunday, February 16th at 2 o'clock on Zoom. Okay. A couple of logistics before I hand it over. This presentation is being recorded for the purposes of us putting it on our YouTube page later and making this more accessible to a larger audience. You are asked to please keep your audio muted at all times, and you are invited to turn off your camera as well so that we can really highlight our speaker in this presentation. There is a chat box available for everyone in the Zoom call. I do ask that you, if you can, set your messages to send to me, Angie Grove, Ethan Allen Homestead. During the presentation, you can submit questions into the chat box, although we will be waiting till the end of the presentation to do the question. So if you submit a question in the chat box during the presentation, we will wait till the end before we get to the question. There will be a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and it will be in the form of me going through the chat box and submitting the questions to Dr. Bruchac to answer. So please submit all your questions into the chat box at the end of the presentation or during the presentation as well. Okay, I think I have gone over everything I needed to say. So I am going to turn it over to Patrick Lamfair, and if I had forgotten anything important, he will make sure to add it in, I'm sure. So Patrick Lamfair is also known as Black Hands. He is a board member at the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. He is a descendant of Ethan Allen himself, as well as a member of Abenaki tribe in Vermont. And so Patrick really has in his blood all aspects of what it is to be a Vermonter. And so please welcome Patrick, who will be introducing our speaker.
Hello. Our lecturer today, Dr. Margaret Bruchac, has had a multimodal career as a performer, ethnographer, historian, author, and museum consultant. At the University of Pennsylvania, she is Professor Emerita of Anthropology, Associate Facility in the Penn Cultural Heritage Center, and founder of the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative. The Ethan Allen Homestead Museum and our guests eagerly await her presentation and thank her for being with us.
Kwai, greetings. In today's talk, I'll be offering a brief overview of historical encounters in the traditional homelands of the indigenous people known as Abenaki or Abenaki. Let me start by offering a brief land acknowledgement. Yodali Nanatak ta Quinatekwa, Yodali Ndakinna, Katsiolioni Miziwa Niguet, Kamikozo Nagoniak. I'm speaking to you today from Nanatak homelands, just south of Abenaki homelands of Vermont and New Hampshire. I am here along the Quinatekwa, the Connecticut River, and in this place I offer thanks to all of our relations gathered together across time. Now, Abenaki territory, as is well documented in archaeological and historical records, hold on one sec, I'm just getting this to advance. There we go. Is a long inhabited indigenous homeland stretching from Sequokiak, Northfield, Massachusetts, in the south to Quinatekwa, the St. Lawrence River in the north, and then east to west from Bitombauk, Lake Champlain, to the Atlantic Ocean, also known as Sabakwa. The name Abenaki derives from the term Wabanakiak, which combines the morphemes for dawn, land, Waban, and land, Aki, with the animate plural ending of Ak to designate people from where the daylight comes, people in this territory. Now, in this particular region, it's important to note that before 1700, there are multiple family groups, kinship groups, tribal groups that call themselves by names that are often locative terms related to the places where they live. So the communities in this area had few hard and fast boundaries before colonists arrived. It was routine for family bands to come together, to disperse, or to relocate at will in response to seasonal needs and external pressures. Collective identities were linked to these locales more than to particular family lineages. The names that are shown here represent the most significant, but not all of them. I should also note there are two broad geographic groups. The coastal or eastern Abenaki include Penobscot, Passamaquoddy, Micmac, and Maliseet of present-day Maine and the Maritimes. And the inland or western Abenaki includes Sokoke at the middle intervales of the Quinatekwa, Coasec at the upper intervales, Pequawket and Pennacook in the White Mountains, and Missisquoi on Lake Champlain, among others. Now, historical records and oral traditions alike testify to these fluid movements around these territories as families revisited particular places and polished old and new kin relations. Now, after 1700, two new Abenaki communities come into being, starting in the late 1600s, in the far north, St. Francois and Becancour. And these were created by groups of Abenaki people that chose to adopt the Catholic religion and enter these missionary communities. And they began at Sillery before relocating northward to the St. Francis River and to the St. Lawrence. Now, the founding populations of those particular villages were obliged to recognize the territorial lands of the Algonquin people who lived in that place when they moved in. One elder from Woolanoke, Francois Neptune, recalled that they agreed that the St. Lawrence River would be a new dividing line between Algonquin territories to the north and Abenaki territories to the south. And before we go too far, let me say a little bit about the oddities of these naming conventions. The present-day state boundaries of Vermont and New Hampshire and the states themselves obviously did not exist until the late 1700s. And yet colonists and antiquarians carved up native territory and wrote about native histories in ways that conceptually pushed Abenaki people out of the picture. For example, in 1700, the name St. Francis Abenaki only applied to the new mission village, St. Francois de Sales. English colonial observers, however, were so clueless about the extent of Abenaki territory that they began to vaguely refer to all Western Abenaki people as though they were St. Francis, regardless of their geographical or tribal origins. And more often, they left them off the map altogether. So Abenaki people on the American side of the border sometimes added to the confusion by embracing the St. Francis designation for their home communities, and even in some cases adopting it as a surname. So given the complexity of these naming traditions over time, it's no wonder that confusion regarding the territorial boundaries and locations persists right into the present day. Now, I've divided this talk into 4 parts. As I say, it's going to be relatively brief. And the first part talks about regional ecosystems and cultural landscapes within what we now call Vermont and New Hampshire. Historian Colin Calloway identifies this region as a pivotal halfway point where multiple trails and waterways came together. And this is the region from Coos in the upper Connecticut to Missisquoi over on Lake Champlain. The area featured rich soils, game-filled forests, and plentiful harvest of trout and salmon. During the 1700s, these forests and mountains made the area appear to the English as though it was a foreboding wilderness, which of course it was not. In Abenaki territory, there were numerous woods, meadows, marshes, arable intervales, upland hunting grounds, all in one contiguous package. And in some locales, the swamps were grown up chiefly with evergreen. The white pine in particular grew quite luxuriously on these lowlands. Here, as elsewhere, water resources were also abundant. Freshwater springs, lakes, rivers, streams teeming with mountain trout, and other significant fishing sites. This particular marker in present-day Swanton, Vermont, highlights the significance of the fisheries at Missisquoi, which have been utilized continuously for more than 10,000 years. And the point I hope to make here is that this is not simply an uninhabited hunting territory that Native people happened to pass through. This was a long inhabited and very well-known homeland for thousands of years since the glaciers retreated. So, for example, on the Merrimack River in Pennacook territory, the Amaskik Falls, named for Namaskik, the fishing place, were a gathering place for hundreds of Native people during the annual spring run of salmon, shad, and sturgeon that ascended these rivers from the sea on their way to the lakes and spawning grounds. Archaeologist Victoria Bunker documented 8,000 years of continuous occupation at this site alone, with fishbone, alewife, shad, blueback herring, etc., present all the way through from the early Archaic Gulf of Maine complex right up through the late Woodland era. Now, Abenaki people utilize multiple fishing technologies in the forms of spears, nets, and dams. On some rivers, they conducted stone weirs called aqueducton to channel fish into traps. In 1888, for example, antiquarian historian George Wheelock described the Indian Dam on the Ashwelot River in Swansea, New Hampshire, as being less than 100 feet wide, but in the shape of a harrow pointing downstream, made of stone such as a man could lift, picked up in the stream above, and varying from 6 to 12 feet in thickness. And around that area, there were more than 20 Indian fireplaces. And incidentally, can I ask those of you who are not part of the Ethan Allen Homestead to turn off your videos? It's getting a little distracting on my end because they keep coming visible. So if you're not speaking, if you could please turn off your video, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. Now, Abenaki territory in present-day Vermont and New Hampshire, as I know, was continuously occupied over millennia, from roughly 12,000 years in the past when the glaciers retreated. During the Woodland era, around 2,000 years before the present, Abenaki people continued their long-standing strategies of seasonal hunting, fishing, and flexible home sites, while adapting to both subtle and dramatic shifts in the climate. Starting around 1,000 years ago, Zea maize, or corn, was introduced, and horticultural activities were added wherever the climate and soil made planting possible. This map, created by archaeologist Duncan Mathewson, contains data from roughly 40 Woodland-era sites, dated from about 100 to 1675 AD. It supports direct evolutionary cultural links and continuity with Native peoples identified as Western Abenaki. And the archaeological evidence at sites like Skitchawag on the alluvial terrace and the floodplain of the river show a wide variety of food debris. Deer, beaver, fox, muskrat, along with non-anadromous fish, turtle, bird, freshwater mussel, acorn, beechnut, butternut, hickory, bitternut, sumac, hawthorn, elderberry, raspberry, cherry, and grape. So in other words, people are not just hunting, they're also collecting multiple edible and medicinal foods. And Mathewson notes that there was nothing random about where Abenaki village sites were situated. The positioning of major settlements near the rich alluvial soils within this protected valley habitat enabled an average growing season of 120 to 130 frost-free days. This was a conscious decision that emerged from accumulated knowledge over time. The Coos region, for example, encompassed two communities clustered around the intervales: Lower Coos around Newbury, Vermont, and Haverhill, New Hampshire, and Upper Coas around Guildhall, Vermont, and Lancaster, New Hampshire. At the top of this particular map is Coasec or Coas, the name deriving from Goasec, white pine place. Again, white pines being numerous around marshy lowlands. The dark green areas indicate the fertile intervales, also called Wolhanok, the hollowed out places, which during the late woodland era were ideal for maize horticulture. This particular map also notes in the middle 4 colonial sites of forts that are located in Sicoki and Sicoki and Coas territory. You can see Kitsipontekwa, the Great Falls, also known as Bellows Falls, Vermont. To the south of them, you can see Peskiomscut, the Great Falls in Pecumtuck territory, in present-day Gill, Massachusetts. Now, Abenaki sites for maize horticulture were ideally situated in these intervales, and they were often planted with interplanting of corn, beans, and squash, also called the Three Sisters. Winter supplies were stored in caches on the hillsides above the banks, and the natural terraces constitute one of the most fertile agricultural environments in the region. And here it's important to note that the Abenaki were not, as some have imagined, backwards or primitive or undeveloped when compared to Haudenosaunee or Six Nations Iroquoian people, who had very large fixed village sites and extensive maize horticulture. For Abenaki people, especially in this dispersed environment, farming was an intermittent activity. Part of the seasonal rounds included multiple relocations and small dispersed sites for hunting, fishing, gathering, harvesting, and ceremonially coming together. Abenaki people also encouraged and maintained forests of desirable species, notably maple and birch, which were tapped for sap, and nut trees like butternut, walnut, hickory, etc., by sowing, transplanting, and thinning tree stands. As just one example of the deep roots of this style of forest management, historian John Moody notes the Bagong Kikawongan, or nut tree agricultural traditions, while noting the preservation of this particular knowledge and the Abenaki name for the Contoocook River, Bagontakwa, or Butternut River. Ancient evidence of these and other useful tree species is also found in pollen cores in the Swansea Bog, which includes walnut, black ash, oak, and maple, dating back 13 to 11,000 years before present. Now, as yet another example of forest management, Abenaki people periodically burn the pitch pine oak forests on sandy outwash river deltas at places like Missisquoi. And I use this example here as one place where some of those pitch pine forests still survive here in Northampton. Now, this practice of burning the forest continued right into the colonial era. In 1772, Peter Kalm remarked on the numerous fires which happen every year in the woods through the Indians who frequently make great fires that spread over the fir woods when everything is dry. Now, these were not, as some have imagined, accidental fires. In fact, burning was conducted to facilitate travel, control pests, flush game, and clear settlements, and had been a common practice for thousands of years. Fire clearing was most intensive in regions where horticulture was practiced, close to alluvial rivers and amid the pitch pine forests, where it left a lasting mark on the landscape. Now, interestingly, although antiquarian historians writing in the late 1800s, early 1900s were aware of these practices, they nonetheless dismissed the obvious evidence, writing, for example, in Sicoki territory, the intervales and meadows at Fort Dummer were found entirely bare of trees. Such was the fact with all the meadows on the Connecticut River at the time of the first settlement of New England. The Indians burned them over every year and used them for planting grounds. And then it says, there are no evidences of Indian settlements in this town. It's astonishing looking at these town histories where over and over again, they note the physical evidence or the archaeological evidence and then insist that no one lived here and no one lives here, which of course is counterfactual. As a poignant example of the durability of Abenaki foodways, one variety of maize from the Coas region persisted right into the 20th century and into the present day in the hands of a local family whose English forebears lived alongside Abenaki people. The Metcalf family retained an old 8-row open-pollinated corn that they grew annually on their Dutton Hill Road farm in Norwich. Today, this variety, which is notable for its short growing season and sturdiness, is actually being marketed by the Fedco Seed Company in Maine as Abenaki Calais Flint corn. Now, in part 2, I discuss how and why we know so little in the present day about this region and this history. Because with all of this environmental abundance and cultural continuity, the general public, including some scholars and some modern media writers, remain confused about Abenaki history in Vermont and New Hampshire. So to understand this confusion, let's examine some colonial maps and some patterns of mapping and claiming territory. Now, as I've noted, archaeological records clearly document significant long-standing presence, but maps from the colonial era are inconsistent. Even when they contain useful information, they always reflect European perspectives. So, for example, in 1660, from the Dutch perspective, New Netherlands was enormous, stretching far beyond its actual boundaries. And you'll note that New England here is tiny, and Lake Champlain is dropped into the middle of New Hampshire rather than at the head of the Hudson River. Everything about this map is skewed to show the Dutch first and foremost as a means of claiming territory. It's also important to note that when native conflicts occurred, and this is a map that shows where various battles were fought during King Philip's War, 1675-76, these conflicts also confused our understanding of the territory because many people were forced to move to other locations, and some were quite literally burned out of their home settlements. In the aftermath of King Philip's War, there were dramatic shifts in tribal movements as families from southern New England began to fold into Abenaki enclaves in present-day Vermont and New Hampshire, and even up into Canada, causing considerable confusion about who is who and which community is which. So, for example, some people fleeing conflicts in southern New England went westward to a new community shown in the lower left of this map at Schaghticoke, which is not Schaghticoke, Connecticut, but Schaghticoke in New York State, which was founded as a refugee village by New York Governor Edmund Andros, who welcomed all Indians who would come and submit to English rule to live under the protection of the government. By the late 1600s, both Coas and Missisquoi also became refugee villages, with people fleeing the raging warfare in the South and folding in temporarily, or in some cases permanently, into those communities. Now here, in looking at this, which we call a diaspora map created by the Pecumtuck Valley Memorial Association, it's important to note that some, but not all, Native families relocated. People traveled in small family bands rather than entire villages, and their travels were rarely one-way trips. As they had for generations, whenever settlers or soldiers or conflicts came too close, people would simply withdraw into marginal territories where they could live without attracting undue attention. And logistically, the French Catholic mission villages along the St. Lawrence River were far too small to absorb entire tribal communities from elsewhere. Instead, they absorbed individual families and some individuals. Now, as an example of people who chose to stay rather than leave, in June of 1704, the Governor General of New France offered refuge at the new mission village of Sillery near Quebec City, but the Coas people flatly refused. Using the language of diplomacy, where they refer to the French governor politely as father, even though he is not literally their father, their delegate stated, "Father, to tell the truth, you have shown great care for me in inviting me to come and settle on your lands. However, I cannot bring myself to settle there because the English have already struck me too hard. I believe, therefore, that the only place where I can strike back against the English is the place I come from, which is called Coassuck. I could not do that easily if I was in your country. Father, hear me. I wish to remain at Coassuck." Now, this is one of many examples of documents that make it very, very clear that Abenaki individuals and communities were speaking up for themselves and were resisting relocation whenever possible. Now, this is one of the early maps, 1715, that shows you where some of the Jesuit missions are created. So there's one at St. Francis or St. Francois, there's one at Coas, there's one at Naransouk or Norridgewock, But again, these missions were small. They were never large enough to absorb everybody, but they did absorb the people who wished to accept protection from the French as part of their strategic choice, let's say. Now, in this particular close-up of this map, you can see those villages I mentioned, and you can see the map is also skewed sideways, so north is off to the right. But also note that Deerfield is off to the left, because 1704 is the infamous attack on Deerfield, Massachusetts. It's also the aftermath of the French-Indian Wars, when many Native people in southern New England are still trying to figure out where to go for safety. Some are moving just a short ways away, some are moving further away. So it's interesting that a map of French missions includes Deerfield, which is not a mission, but is a crucial location. At that point in time, it was the furthest west of English settlements in what we now call New England. Now, this particular map from 1755 reveals the ignorance of colonial observers who had neither settled nor surveyed the territory. Most of Western Abenaki territory is described on this map as wilderness lands of the Crown not yet appropriated. The Crown is claiming them, but has not conducted any deeds or formal transfers. There is an indication just northeast of number 4 Stevens Fort, indicating the need for a double line of towns for a frontier against the Indians. You can see this is in the midst of the French and Indian Wars. A directional line, not exactly a road, also marks the path from Crown Point to Stevens Fort, about 60 miles long. Now, more information can be found in this 1761 map. In this particular case, you can see at the bottom a boundary line, this curved line that indicates the Mason claim. And that's actually worth talking about briefly because it inspires much of the confusion that we live with today. The Mason claim was a series of royal grants from the Council of Plymouth to Pennacook and Pawtucket Abenaki lands. These lands, granted in the 1620s to Captain John Mason and Sir Fernando Gorges, formed the foundation of what would become the emerging New Hampshire colony. In 1629, John Wheelwright of Massachusetts Bay Colony to the south contested the Mason claim, asserting that he had actually purchased the territory directly from the Pennacook sachem Passaconaway. But in the end, Wheelwright's claims, and by extension, native rights to the territory, were flatly denied by the English crown. So after several more generations, Mason's great-great-great-great-grandson, John Tufton Mason, sold the territory to Massachusetts Bay for £500 and then negotiated with Benning Wentworth and a number of others to create the province of New Hampshire and include that territory. We'll return to this in a bit. Now, a close-up of that map shows, quote, the Connecticut River has been surveyed no further than the Great Intervales. And you'll note the Connecticut River takes this odd turn because they're guessing at its location on this particular map. And the mouths of the rivers are known, but the course and branches are uncertain. Lines from the Connecticut River over to Lake Champlain are also seen on this map, noting routes where captives have been carried by the Indians. The northernmost captive trail formed the foundation for what would become the 1775 Bailey-Hazen Road, which followed the old Indian Trail cutting from Coos to Missisquoi. Now in this map, 1768, it's a little clearer. So you can see Missisquoi, Coos, and other locations are clearly marked. And you can see the White Mountains are identified as Pennacook territory, and the upper Kennebec River is identified as Kennebec territory. And on a close-up of this map, you can also see at the top the term Arusagundakuk. And that's a very interesting point because Arusagundakuk quite literally translates to empty cabin village. And it indicates an Abenaki mission ancillary that was abandoned due to an outbreak of smallpox. And that's part of what convinced people to move further north. Now, this map also, if you can see this, locates Scatucook, which used to be in New York State, and Missisquoi, because it does refer to the time when Scatucook refugees left New York State, left the protection of New York, and moved in with the Missisquoi Abenaki. And there are oral traditions as well as written traditions that document that quite clearly in the 1740s. Now, Missisquoi appears in far more detail on a 1762 survey of Lake Champlain that was commissioned by Sir William Johnson and drawn by William Brassier. On the northeastern shore, it notes, this swamp was not surveyed, it being not to be done without a great deal of time and difficulty. The creek which runs through it is deep, but only boats can get in by reason of the sands, without which it is passable for boats to within a quarter of a mile of the Indian castle. That swamp is now the 900-acre Maquam Bog and Creek that are part of the Missisquoi National Wildlife Refuge. But interestingly, on a site just above the Chazy River, there is a reference to the aftermath of Rogers' raid, the 1759 attack on the Abenaki village of St. Francis. It notes, on this part of the shore, Major Rogers had an engagement in 1760 with a large body of French and Indians. Now, here it's important to note that Abenaki communities routinely lent support to one another in times of war. In 1757, a group of Missisquoi Abenaki warriors had relocated to Becancour to scout for the French army, while most people remained behind at Missisquoi. And then Canadian Abenaki refugees, in their turn, took shelter at Missisquoi in the winter of 1759 to 60, after Rogers' men had burned their home village at St. Francis. Now, looking more closely at Missisquoi Bay, this map also indicates, as I noted earlier, the location of the Missisquoi Indian Castle that was used by the 18th century Waranoco and Missisquoi war chief Greylock. Greylock was a descendant of some of those Waranoco people from southern Massachusetts who relocated to Schaghticoke and then relocated northward to Missisquoi. Greylock was both highly successful and highly notorious for his ability in warfare. His Abenaki given name was Wawanolowat, which literally means he who fools the others or puts someone off their track. And it explains his exploits during Dummer's War so clearly that the name may have been bestowed on him during that time, replacing whatever name he might have had before that. Now, about 120 miles north of Missisquoi is the community of St. Francis, or Odanak, as I note, which was first established as a Catholic mission in 1683 at Sillery, before overpopulation, soil depletion, and smallpox forced its relocation to the St. Francis River. The village was quite small. A 1798 Crown survey fixed the boundaries at only 2 miles square. But over time, families from more than 20 distinct Abenaki communities passed through Odanak, primarily from Sokoke, Pennacook, Missisquoi, and Coas. The population was neither large nor static. Individuals and families came and went at will, returning to their home territories whenever religious and social conflicts became too difficult to bear. So in part 3, let me say a little bit about colonial encounters. During the first 2 centuries of colonial contact, the desires of colonial settlers, global trade competition, and rivalries between various European powers, primarily French and English, directly impacted the lives of all Native people in what we now call New England and the Northeast. The fur trade at first was a largely market-based scheme for European settlers. Mercantile interests encouraged expanded hunting, which altered indigenous relations with fur bearers and provoked competition over traditional hunting territories. Through the fur trade, indigenous foods like corn and ceremonial objects like wampum also began to acquire new values. Local economies shifted from those based in reciprocal relations to those oriented to market relations. Some European materials like copper pots and knives were embraced as they were, but others, also like copper pots, were cut into new forms. Copper was used for brass effigies, arrow points, and ornaments. Abenaki relations with French and English colonists depended in large part on where they were geographically situated. So, for example, at a 1703 conference with Massachusetts Governor Dudley, the Eastern Abenaki in Maine declared themselves to be brothers to the French, dwelling in the same cabin at 2 fires, whereas the Western Abenaki were often closer to the English, trading at Albany and even other locations as well. In a 1752 meeting with English Captain Phineas Stevens, the Abenaki sachem Atawanito made a very forceful statement of independence from all European powers, noting that although there were alliances with the French, who had provided some goods and some necessities, he said, "Brothers, we tell you we seek not war, we ask nothing better than to be quiet, and it depends, brothers, only on you English to have peace with us. We have not yet sold the lands we inhabit, we wish to keep possession of them. And here he's referring to the lands in what's now southern New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island. And this is before Vermont is established as a state, and it's before New Hampshire is fully colonized. So in the midst of all this, there are also interesting alliances to pay attention to, because Abenaki people participated to varying degrees in several regional intertribal alliances. The Wabanaki Confederacy, within the black outline shown here roughly, grouped together Eastern and Western Abenaki communities with common cause, and they held a council fire at a Mohawk community, Ganawage, because at this point they were also negotiating new relations with the Haudenosaunee. And then there was also the Seven Nations Confederacy within this black outline, which was the Catholic villages along the St. Lawrence. Now, these alliances are quite confusing, since some communities were active members of both, some were members of none, and some joined, left, or rejoined at will, however it suited community needs at the time. Every nation spoke for itself, and as a case in point, in 1721, a number of Wabanaki and Seven Nations Confederacy members wrote to Massachusetts Governor Samuel Shute, and they forcefully stated they had not consented to the conquest of their lands and the sale of those lands, despite what any individual Native person or nation might say or do. And these letters included pictographic signatures representing more than 18 distinct tribal communities. Mrs. Coy is here identified with the turtle in the lower left, but interestingly, Penobscot and Coas are notably absent. And that complaint states in part, you see from the peace treaty of which I am sending you a copy that you must live peacefully with me. Is it living in peace to take my land against my will? You have nevertheless been doing so for several years by establishing yourself there and fortifying there against my will. And they note at the end, this is not the word of 4 or 5 savages that by your presence, lies, and tricks, you can make easily fall into your feelings. It is the word of the entire Abenakis nation spread across this continent and in Canada, and of all the other Christian savages, their allies. Now, obviously, that's overreach. It's not one nation, it's multiple individual nations, but it's making the point that they are in common cause rejecting English domination. But when paper diplomacy failed, warfare occurred. This shows the burning of Deerfield in 1704 is just one example of many. And the conflicts that emerged during the fur trade in part resulted from the fact that land was being introduced as collateral. And so when the fur trade declined, native indebtedness played a large role in alienating land and provoking violent reactions. And native warriors sometimes took personal vengeance on individual perpetrators. One of the most famous was in 1689, at the outset of King William's War, when Abenaki men descended on a trading post in Dover, New Hampshire, and tradition asserts that the Pennacook raiders crossed out their accounts on Major Waldron's body. So those conflicts provoked multiple relocations. From the 1670s to the 1760s, families moved in and out of refugee locations. And when conflicts ended, they would move back to familiar territories. And one place that people never left was Missisquoi. This marker, erected in 1993 by the Vermont Division of Historic Preservation, tells us little about that. But the interesting thing is that Missisquoi, people chose an interesting strategy in that some Missisquoi tribal members decided to allow the French to come in to build a sawmill. And in 1748, a grant was given to Nicholas René Levasseur. But when the French Indian Wars ended, English settlers started flooding into the region, pushing the French out and also trying to push the Abenaki out. And at that point, land speculators, including Ira Allen, started spreading the falsehood that the Missisquoi were not residents but foreigners, claiming that they all came from Canada, that they didn't actually live here. And this was part of a larger effort to falsely depict Vermont as uninhabited land, somehow free for the taking. The Missisquoi, of course, pushed back about that. You can see here they vaguely identify themselves as St. Francis, but they note they've inhabited that part of Lake Champlain from time immemorial. They note the French sawmill, and then they say the English people have now tried to take the territory. So this pushing back is characteristic in all the colonial records, where Native people in their home territories are refusing to leave, but what they can't fight is the mapping strategies of colonial leaders. This particular map, and again, it's skewed, so north is now to the lower left, but it shows the townships and grants that were established by New Hampshire Governor Benning Wentworth without any negotiations, without any treaties, just flatly taking the territory. And from 1740s onward, then being empowered by the English king to give this territory as outright grants to land brokers and French and Indian War veterans. And as you can note in the detail here, there's no reference to Abenaki communities, no indication that anyone else lives here or lived here, but just carving up the territory and handing it out. And then making matters worse, then of course the Allens, Green Mountain Boys, decide to create the independent Republic of Vermont. So although the 1783 Treaty of Paris had settled the conflict between America and Britain, Vermont still did not exist. And so land prospectors like the Allens redoubled their aggressive land grabs and started marketing Abenaki lands to war veterans. And although the Continental Congress initially rejected this new republic, and the Allens considered for a time pledging loyalty to Britain instead, Vermont finally became a state in 1791. Now, Colonel Timothy Bedell had recommended that land be set aside for Abenaki veterans, but that promise never came to pass. Another large tract of Abenaki land, here called Indian Stream, caught the eye of another group of settlers. And in this case, surveyor Jonathan Eastman obtained title from one lone Indian, an Abenaki man who called himself King Philip. And in return for the right to hunt and fish, Philip supposedly deeded a large tract of territory. But in 1798, and you can see the outline of the territory here on the right in the upper part of New Hampshire, but 5 more St. Francis Abenaki then came in and claimed the territory and offered to sell it again. The legislature turned them down, but a trio of private individuals called the Bedell Company secured a deed for 16,000 acres for about $3,000. Now here I should note that these land transactions were strictly illegal. The American congressional legislation passed in 1790 explicitly prohibited private individuals from buying land from Native people. And yet the Eastman and Bedell companies proceeded to sell the land to other settlers and speculators, making no attempt whatsoever to get federal permission or Abenaki negotiations. And the establishment of this supposedly independent republic set off disputes over competing land claims that were never settled until 1842. I shouldn't say never, were not settled until 1842. And in the end, the Indian Stream enterprise and the dodgy land sales, including Vermont, had a devastating effect. When a new hard legal boundary was drawn between the US and Canada, it cut right through Abenaki homelands, creating fraud interpretations that, having never been resolved, continue to generate confusion today. And the last part of this, which I'll go through rather quickly, time does not permit discussion of the many, many other well-documented details of Abenaki history, including the many first-person accounts of captives, missionaries, soldiers, and others. But for today, I'll end with a few examples of what I call hidden in plain sight. Patterns of life in the Northeast that made Native people seem to be vanishing even when they were visible and present. Because by the 1800s, many Abenaki families and most Northeastern Native people had adapted to settled lifestyles, living in farmsteads rather than wigwams, wearing a mix of Native and European dress, and otherwise ceasing to be obviously visible as exotic others. During the late 1800s, despite the new political boundaries, Native families generally ignored the boundaries, continuing to travel freely around and between Quebec, Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, etc., traveling from Missisquoi to the Champlain Islands and even into the Adirondacks. But local historians, meanwhile, started actively promoting the myth that Abenaki people had abandoned the region and that any Native people spotted anywhere in the region were simply wanderers or interlopers who came from somewhere else. Seasonal encampments were set up at tourist destinations like Saratoga Springs and hotels along Lake Champlain and the White Mountains. And during the last few decades of the 1800s, there was a little sort of reverse diaspora, as some Abenaki families from Canada decided to come back to New England. The most visible of these were people who chose to publicly use their identities as a selling point for marketing their wares, and they often also sold picture postcards like these as another source of income. In 1884, for example, Odanak chief Joseph Laurent moved his family to Intervale, New Hampshire, and set up an Abenaki Indian shop and camp. During the same decade, Louis Watso and Catherine Tahamont moved to Blodgett Landing on Lake Sunapee. But interestingly, like other Native artisans of the time, these families chose to dress in stereotypically Indian outfits that were not made but purchased from a costume company. In this case, the Dumoulin Brothers Costume Company had created a series of costumes for the Improved Order of Red Men, which was a fraternal society of elite white men, not Native people, and then made these costumes available. And interestingly enough, many Native people purchased them and then chose to use them as their quote unquote Indian dress. It's an interesting role reversal. But the exodus from Canada was inspired in large part by the restrictions of the 1876 Indian Act. There were some benefits, housing, medical care, education, etc., to living in Canada, but Indian agents in Canada were now empowered to heavily penalize anyone who insisted on sticking to the old ways, whether it was language, dress, ceremonies, dances, songs, etc. Amendments to the Indian Act placed a ban on dances and traditional ceremonies and created industrial residential schools and made school attendance compulsory with strict truancy penalties. Other amendments to the Act banned the pursuit of Indian land claims. And these harsh measures help explain why some families felt compelled to leave reserves and locate elsewhere. Now, outside of those reserves, many Native people continued what had been long-standing intergenerational patterns of seasonal movement through familiar homelands. Margaret Tahamont, for example, in a letter here to her cousin Emma Mead, recalled that her family traveled every fall and winter with a horse and wagon, coming back and forth, across borders, traveling through Lake George, Lake Champlain, Rouse's Point, Missisquoi, quote, traveling through Vermont and New Hampshire, peddling baskets, trading horses, and gypsying around. Now, gypsy was a term not for Romany people, but for Abenaki people who traveled. And here's an old photograph of a band of outlawed gypsies in Bellows Falls in 1908. But there were dangers to being visible. Some of these Abenaki families were explicitly targeted by advocates of eugenic sterilization, notably the program directed by Henry Perkins at the University of Vermont, who was particularly concerned about the threat to Vermont's civil society. In one of his reviews, Perkins wrote that the fine old stock of original settlers in Vermont, Warners and the Allens and their ilk, were among the best human material at hand. And he noted there were ways of improving the population by encouraging larger families among the physically and mentally fit, but also by bringing about a less rapid increase through eugenics. He noted there are what may be called undertones of defectiveness or criminality or disease. Family A, for example, which happened to be the Phillips family, one of the best-known Abenaki families. This whole family, numbering well over 150 individuals, retains its ancestors' roving or gypsy tendency. They are horse traders, fortune tellers, and basket weavers. Now, although the eugenics record concealed individual names, the damage to the families was considerable. Subsequent apologies issued by the University of Vermont in 2019 and by the Vermont State Legislature in 2021 make it clear that Abenaki families were explicitly targeted for removal. But some families persisted and were surprisingly well documented. For example, Sarah Jackson Summers lived most of her life in her family's ancestral Coas territory, where her father relocated in 1824, along with 9 other families, 41 people in all. There they hired out as day laborers, worked as guides for hunting, fishing, and surveying, and the women built quite a market for their baskets. The descendants of this family still live in Coas today, including Abenaki historian Trudy Ann Parker, Sarah's direct descendant. But here is where historian Jean O'Brien's research is illuminating, because the well-honed art of maintaining a low profile also meant that people were frequently misidentified and thus can be difficult to document. Even when local historians acknowledged that their neighbors were Native, they still denied they were authentic Indians. So, for example, in the census rolls, Sarah Parker here, Sarah Summers, and her entire family are identified as white people, which of course is false. And then if we look at census rolls across the country, one common misunderstanding is that these are factual documents, and they often are not. And the federal Indian census, which did not begin until the 1880s, is equally flawed because it was either not taken or it was poorly taken. And as noted here, there is often no discernible order to the listing of families. In the census rolls themselves, obsolete spellings are often used, and the name of a tribe may be spelled several ways in different rolls. Sometimes even the name used for a tribe was changed from year to year. So it can be extraordinarily difficult to track paper documentation when the records themselves are so skewed and flawed. And my point is this: histories in the Northeast are often incomplete, incorrect, or missing altogether. Jean O'Brien identifies this problem as firsting and lasting, where she notes that the literary tradition of firsting, which valorized colonial settlers as the supposedly first settlers of an area, or first to live in an area permanently, implies that history only begins after colonization. And the practice of lasting, or romantically eulogizing the last Indian in each of these towns, provides an imagined end date after which Native people supposedly no longer existed. Even well-known families were subject to misidentification. For example, Israel Sedekis and Mary Watso, who settled in Keene, New Hampshire, established a successful basket-making industry, lumber mill, and tannery. And yet the 1897 birth certificate of their daughter, Elizabeth, identifies her as white, despite both of her parents being unambiguously identified as Indian. Paper erasures like these are very common in the Northeast, where skin color was a floating identifier, and identity or ethnicity was often in the eyes of the beholder. And these misperceptions persist today in media reports that continue to haunt Abenaki people with accusations of authenticity when the records themselves are inauthentic. And yet, Abenaki people have survived, retaining important familial, cultural, and material connections to their past. As just one example, here's Elizabeth Sedekis' granddaughter, Lynn Murphy, measuring an ash splint basket woven by her ancestor, Sophie Watso. And as one of many examples of cross-border cooperation, Odanak citizen Cecile Wawanolet, a descendant of Greylock and one of the last native Abenaki speakers of her generation, spent more than a decade teaching classes of the language at Missisquoi and Odanak. Her son, Joseph Elie Joubert, continued this work, and my nephew, Jesse Bowen Bruchac, now continues that work. And both Cecile and Elie served as inspirational mentors for Jesse when he was learning the language, and for the program that he runs at Middlebury College even today. And so in closing, this needs to be said. Abenaki territory in present-day Vermont and New Hampshire has never been uninhabited. For generations before and after colonial contact, Abenaki families across Ndakinna have watched over burial grounds, sacred sites, hunting territories, and local ecologies. With assistance from groups like the Winter Center for Indigenous Traditions, they continue to quietly steward cultural resources like medicinal plants, ash trees, sweetgrass beds, and springs. And recently, Vermont's Abenaki tribes and the Vermont Abenaki Artists Association have partnered with the Vermont Urban and Community Forest Program on the Black Ash Project to monitor and preserve ash forests. These actions over time demonstrate the kind of persistence against all odds that characterizes so many Abenaki individuals and families in present-day Vermont and New Hampshire today. With many thanks to the many scholars who have worked on this, and the many Abenaki people who have persisted to the present, and especially with thanks to the National Park Service for supporting this research project. Gutsi thank you. Wili Nanawalmazi, be well. Wili Bumkani, travel well.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bruchac. Just want to confirm, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you. Okay, thank you so much. There are people who are giving thumbs up and applause emojis in the chat box, just so
Thank
you
you.
know. And at this point, I would like to invite all of our audience members to put their questions into the chat box. We will be doing questions in the chat box and in the chat box only. So please submit your questions there. If you can change who the question is sent to. You can send it directly to me, Angie G., Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. And Dr. Bruchac, just so you know, Eugene Prochnow has put outstanding presentation. Thank you in the chat box.
Much appreciated.
Phil and Andrea have, I'm going to, Patrick gave me a mini lesson in pronouncing Abenaki, so I'm going to give this a try. Kachi Wilnwini Phil, from Phil and Andrea.
Close enough.
Okay, thank you. So while people are thinking of their questions, putting them in their chat box, I have prepared a few questions for you to get us started, if that's okay.
Sure.
So my first question for you, I just jotted down some notes kind of in the chronology of the presentation. So the first question I wrote down had a question about those early town histories you were mentioning, the ones that are mostly written in the early to mid 1800s. And you had mentioned a number of them that gave descriptions of the physical evidence of Abenaki presence and occupation on those sites, primarily through the clearing of farm fields along the intervales of the river. But how then they would also, in the next paragraph, say, there are no Native Americans who have ever lived here. And I was wondering if you have found in your research a theme as to, that gives you an indication as to why they had these discrepancies so close together in their histories. Was it just plain denial? Was it perhaps something more of like a lost in cultural translation, where the English settlers' idea of a village, idea of a—
Oh no, yeah, it's definitely not lost in translation.
Okay,
Yeah,
because with the transitive nature of some of the Abenaki communities, I was wondering if that could be why.
So that transitive nature is highly visible, and it's noted in virtually every soldier's account, captive's account. And part of why I can say this is that over the past year, my colleague Barb Matthews and I, in doing consulting work for the National Park Service, read through and examined hundreds and hundreds of town histories, hundreds of primary documents, and we found that pattern is quite consistent, because the town histories were written as part of the effort of claiming the land and establishing the town and valorizing the first settlers. And the first settlers in those town histories are the white men and women who fought against these savage Indians, not to put it too lightly. And so the pattern is to say there was a wilderness here, and then people valiantly came into the wilderness, fought off the Indians, established a town, and then history begins. So it's inherently false, but it's a pattern that becomes very, very popular. So Jeannie O'Brien noted the pattern in southern New England, in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and then the same pattern affects northern New England. And it's interesting that the land grants are coming very shortly before those town histories are being written. So in an odd way, some of the most authentic representation of the history of Abenaki people comes from captives and soldiers. And in some cases, captives who resisted being returned to their families and who wished to stay with Native people after being taken captive.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That does remind me of one of the people who will be featured in our new exhibit is Joseph Louis Gill, whose parents fit that description.
Exactly.
Europeans who were captured and chose to stay afterwards. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to read a question from the chat box now. This question is from Sarah Smith. She's wondering about the eugenics practices, particularly in Vermont, about their documentation. How well documented are those eugenics practices? How confident are we in what we know about them today?
So the person that I trust the most on looking at eugenics records is Judy Dow, in part because her family was targeted, and she worked very closely with survivors of eugenics, people who themselves had been sterilized as young women and lamented living out their lives with no family around them. So but the records are interesting because they were sealed until the 1970s. So it was almost impossible for anyone from, say, the 1920s into the 1970s to know what was in those records. And the logic was that it was somehow protecting people by sealing the records. The other part of the logic was protecting people by concealing their identities. So all of the names in the eugenics records are pseudonyms. They are not the names of the actual people being targeted. So part of how we can match up what's happening in the records and what's happening on the ground is families who know they were targeted, people who knew they had been sterilized, people who literally moved from state to state to escape social service workers, eugenicists, etc., who were targeting them as unwanted people, because the records themselves identify the unwanted as criminals, gypsies, pirates, river rats, all these code names for things that people are doing that are somehow antisocial. But in many cases, those things people are doing are part of their traditional lifestyle. They've been doing them for a very long time. So it's interesting that in the present day, there are a few people who dismiss the eugenics records, but they really don't understand how the process worked, how people were targeted, and why the names are confusing. So if someone were to say, for example, oh, there's no mention of Abenaki in the eugenics records, well, that's true. There's no mention of any tribal identity or individual identity or family name.
Yes, it reminds me of what you were saying earlier in your near the end of your presentation about sometimes the records aren't a great source.
Exactly.
The records lied. People lied. Yeah,
Yep.
they were, yes. Okay, another question from the chat box is asking specifically about an event in the Revolutionary War, what is commonly known as the Royalton Raid. And Eugene Prochnow would like to know what you know about Abenaki participation in the Royalton Raid. Do you know who participated in the Royalton Raid and what the role of Abenakis may have been?
I actually don't know a great deal about that event. It's incredibly confusing because it's in Abenaki territory, but the raiders are apparently Mohawk people. And I'm just going to leave it there because I don't want to misstate what little I know about that particular raid.
Thank you, Dr. Bruchac. I do know, as someone who has recently tried to do some research in the role of Abenaki peoples during the Revolutionary War in general, the consensus that kept coming across as I kept going from expert to expert is there isn't enough research done at all about the role of Abenaki and how they experienced the Revolutionary War. So if anyone on this call would like to dig in deeper, that is a prime area for research where there are people who want to know.
Yeah. Well, and we did do some work on that, looking at the Revolutionary War in particular, not the Royalton Raid, but especially the fact that so many Coas Abenaki people were part of Timothy Bedell's regiment. And that's why there was that inherent promise to set aside land for these veterans. But interestingly enough, when you look at the colonial records themselves, it is very chaotic because people are choosing to ally with whichever European colonial power might help them at that moment in time. And at times within these communities, there is very dense documentation of differences between families, between individuals, about who to ally with and where to go. So there actually is a lot on the Revolutionary War in particular. And here I would again point to Colin Calloway as an amazing source. Lisa Brooks has done work on King Philip's War and also the Revolutionary War. There are a number of historians who have looked at that. So the records are there.
Thank you. There is another question related to the Revolutionary War, so I'm going to jump down to that one in the chat box since we're on that topic. But before I read the question, Elise Guyette, who's another local historian here in Vermont, focusing on early Vermont years, has suggested a book, We Go as Captives, which does focus on the Royalton Raid. So if there's anyone on this call who wants to learn more, you can check out that book, We Go as Captives. Okay, so the next Revolutionary War related question is coming from Dr. Zachary Bennett, who is an early American historian here in Vermont. He is asking about scalp bounties, and he's wondering what you know about how the introduction of scalp bounties from colonial governments affected the different Wabanaki settlements that remained in northern New England.
Oh, that's a grisly question, because scalp bounties, I mean, scalping was a traditional practice to a degree, but it increased dramatically as a direct result of these scalp bounties. And the scalp bounties became easy ways for individuals or communities to make money by literally hunting down Native people. So for instance, in Pequawket territory, the local minister of the English town is going out hunting Pequawket Abenaki, including Maliakat's kin. In Northampton, people are coming from this town to go northward to Coas territory hunting Indians. And so the most tragic thing about the scalp bounties is that they're not just being practiced in warfare, but they are literally looking for individual families and communities to just take them for funds. And of course, there's the infamous Hannah Dustin story, where Hannah Dustin is taken as a captive from Massachusetts. And along the way, in the middle of the night, she enlists the support of 2 other captives with her to kill and scalp most of the Abenaki people she's traveling with, which is an extended family, including multiple children. So I'd actually rather not talk in detail about scalp bounties because it is such a grisly topic, but suffice to say that they increase in volume and danger, and that also increases the necessity for Abenaki people to literally keep their heads down just to survive.
Thank you for your insight on that topic. I have a question in the comments from John Devono, who's here, part of the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum's board, who I think his question is asking us to jump back even further in time than the Revolutionary War, quite a bit back. And he's wondering, what is the current theory as to where Abenaki peoples came from? Now, John, maybe you can unmute, since you are our lecture chair actually for the museum. You can either unmute to clarify or in the chat box clarify if I'm not asking this correctly, but the way that I'm reading it is the idea of like how far back. Are we talking 10,000 years, 12,000 years, 15,000 years, crossing the ice bridge over from Russia, or like where is that like lineage come from historically in the thousands of years?
Okay, so throw out the ice bridge idea, because that is not the source of the peopling of the Americas. The archaeological traditions have been shifting quite dramatically, and this is where I'd actually, I think it's called the Indigenous Paleolithic by Paulette Steeves, is the current best source on the archaeological origins of indigenous people in the Americas. And in Abenaki territory, we know for a fact that the glaciers happened. We know the area was covered by glaciers roughly 12,000 years ago. And the minute the glaciers start to recede, coexisting with that time period of the glacial recession are artifacts that indicate people are living here. So we have no reason to believe that Abenaki people came across an ice bridge and traveled the continent to get to here. We have plenty of reason to believe that they were here and are here. And again, the archaeological records document that quite clearly.
Thank you. Okay, the last question that I see in the chat box, so I'll look again after I ask this one, is asking about the different confederations that you mentioned in your presentation. You had the map and had, I believe, 2 different areas kind of circled or rectangled in black. How effective and how long lasting were these confederations?
So the Wabanaki Confederacy, depending on who you talk to, is either ancient or in direct response to colonization. Personally, I happen to believe that it's ancient, but I can also see in the records that these confederacies shifted in response to French and English interventions. And so in some cases, what we call a confederacy is more properly an alliance among different tribal nations with common cause. And again, this was a quick talk, but just glossing over it briefly, these alliances were always flexible. People were not locked in as members of those alliances to always act on behalf of everyone in the alliance. Instead, they maintained sovereignty over their own community and their own interests, and then acted in alliance when it suited them. And this is where King Philip's War is another great example, where initially some tribal communities were not participating in King Philip's War, and others joined at various points in time. It's also why the records of these confederacies are so confusing, because the Seven Nations Confederacy does not exist until those Catholic mission villages are founded. But the Seven Nations Confederacy also had close relations with the Six Nations Confederacy, which is the Haudenosaunee. And the Haudenosaunee was initially a Five Nations Confederacy. So the number of tribal groups in a confederacy or an alliance depends on the point in time, their geographical location, their individual interests, and who their opposition is. So who they need to come together in alliance against. And I mean, there's much more I can say, but suffice to say that some of the new research coming out now on the Seven Nations and Wabanaki Confederacy in particular is piecing together oral traditions and written traditions and material traditions. So for instance, as some of you may know, I do research on wampum, and I'm finding that there is a category of wampum that consists of wampum belts that were broken and repaired or assembled from multiple broken pieces. And those seem to be associated with the Seven Nations Alliance. So I can see in these material objects that they retain traces of something that came before, and they have now been remade and repurposed for something that exists in a different time.
Thank you for that extra information, Dr. Bruchac. Okay, so I'm going to ask the last question here, but before I ask the last question, can I ask, is there a way that audience members may be able to contact you? Do you have a public email or a website or anything if anyone did want to reach out and ask further questions about this presentation?
Sure. So as you noted earlier on, I'm Professor Emerita from the University of Pennsylvania. So you can still contact me through my pen address, which is mbruchac@sas.upenn.edu. I can't guarantee I'll always answer. I'm in the middle of a number of projects, but I can also say that this particular research formed the foundation of a large report that Barbara Matthews and I created for the National Park Service, and that report will eventually be publicly available. It's being reviewed right now by the Park Service, and once they finish that particular review, then it will be made public. I can't tell you exactly when that will be, but hopefully it will be soon.
Thank you very much. And I did just put that email address into the chat box. So if anyone there hasn't seen it yet, go ahead and take a look in the chat box there. And I'm also putting into the chat box links to a couple of the organizations that Dr. Bruchac, Abenaki organizations that Dr. Bruchac mentioned in her presentation, including the Abenaki Artists Association here in Vermont, the Winter Center for Indigenous Traditions, and also Alnobairi, which is the Abenaki culture group that shares the site here at the Okinawan Homestead with us as well, that all work on Abenaki cultural information. So please check those out in the chat box. Okay, so the last question, a couple of people have asked this in the chat box, and I'm going to add on to it a little bit, but the question is, how can people, specifically maybe non-Abenaki Vermonters or New Englanders, I'm going to pull up the question again, sorry. How can they, the way that the question was worded is, how could they address the misinformation, the assault, the counter assault from the Canadian Abenaki is the way the question's worded. And I would like to add on to that, particularly if you have any books, videos, websites, online courses that you could recommend for further education in the issue of the Abenaki and Indigenous peoples in New England.
I'd say the most important thing is to keep in mind that tribal nations have the right to speak for themselves, but they do not have the right to govern other tribal nations. And that's a sort of bottom line truth that many people miss. So there is no dispute between the entire nation in any location. There are disputes between individuals, and there are disputes that are being promoted by particular individuals for their own particular reasons. But often what is happening is that modern media has been sort of seduced by the seemingly lurid nature of charges that effectively are slanderous and libelous and historically false. So I do not encourage people to weigh into the dispute and try to take sides. There's no point in taking sides. There are no sides to be taken. I think the important thing is to respect individuals, families, and tribal communities and respect their right to govern themselves as they see fit, their right to live in their home territories as they see fit, and do not encourage one against the other. So there are a number of people at St. Francis at Odanek, for example, who are close family friends and have been for generations and will remain so despite these disputes. There are friendships and kinship relations that go far beyond all of this. So it's almost as though you need to recognize this is a moment in time when the chaos that we see in the world around us is being reflected in the worlds between us. And anything we can do to step back from that chaos and be kind to one another will help everyone in the long run.
Those are wise words that can be universally applied to so many situations. Thank you. I hope people listen. Okay, so I want to thank you once again, and thank you everyone in the audience. Before everyone logs off, I do have one other quick announcement really quickly. The Ethan Allen Homestead Museum is looking for artists. We do have a call for artists on our Facebook page and on our website, and we're looking for artists who can create custom pieces. These are paid gigs, funded through a grant by the Vermont Historical Society and the Vermont Arts Council. So if you are an artist or you know an artist who is looking for a little bit of work, and we are looking for diverse artists. In particular, one of the pieces we'd like to commission is a piece to represent Joseph Louis Gill, who was an Abenaki leader during the Revolutionary War. So please spread the word and have them check out our website and contact us on ethanallenhomestead@gmail.com. So I just wanted to put that out there real quick while I had a captive audience here. For those of you who are wondering, this presentation will be available on YouTube. It is put to our YouTube channel, which is at Ethan Allen Homestead, usually a couple of weeks after. It takes a little bit of time to do the editing and get it uploaded. But if you are on our email contact list, you will get the notification when it's available, and it'll also be posted to our Facebook page when it is available as well. Okay, and I'm also putting one more message in the chat box that has a link to it that does go to the donation page for the Ethan Allen Homestead Museum. If you so wished to leave a donation, we are a nonprofit museum, and donations do help us put on educational programs such as this. So that link is available in the chat box if you did want to give. Okay, so if everyone can help me thank Dr. Margaret M. Bruchac one more time. We really appreciated your time and your insight on all of this. And please remember her email was in the chat box. I hope you grabbed it so that you can contact her if you had further questions. Dr. Bruchac, there are people who are saying thank you. What a great presentation, great questions, great answers. People who are using the heart emoji and the applause emoji in the chat box as well. So we really appreciated your time with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
Okay. And with that, everyone, I hope you have a great Sunday afternoon, and keep an eye on our website, our Facebook page for further programming and for the recording of this one as well. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.